Hi everybody, my name is Robert Morgan. I'm talking to you today also about the history of the Coptic Orthodox people and our church. Because I've done a lot of research about this subject, I just wanted to give a few questions for everybody and just make you think about our history, our Coptic history. It's a very interesting subject for me, but I'm not sure if it's interesting for everybody else. For me, I find that knowing more about my history, knowing more about my culture, knowing more about my heritage preserves my identity, preserves the Coptic identity for everybody. As I mentioned previously, I have written a history book about our Coptic culture and our Orthodox people of Egypt. Which is basically I published last year. Few questions for everybody that I don't know if they're going to find interesting or not. Do we know anything about how many popes came and sat on St. Mark's seat in Egypt? Actually, it's in Alexandria, because St. Mark started his ministry in Alexandria, not in there was no Cairo at the time, basically. All this information is included in the book that I've written. It's also, what was the population of Egypt at the time? What is our background? Are we all Egyptians, or was there other immigrants at the time of when Christianity started in Egypt? How long did Christ stay in Egypt? Did he come for 1 month, 2 months, 3 months, a year? Do we know? Where did he stay? Where did he pass? Everybody, I think we're well aware that Christ came to the land of Egypt, and there was a certain path, and they passed by certain parts of Egypt, and the parts that Christ and the Holy Family, the Virgin Mary and Joseph, all these parts were blessed as holy land. So Egypt should be considered as a holy land as well. Where did they stay in Egypt? Are the places known? And what do they represent to the Egyptians and to the entire world, in fact, to the entire Christian world, in fact? Other questions. How was Egypt run at the time? Who ran the country? Do we know who governed Egypt at the time? Do we know what happened to the people? Was Egypt, like I asked before, was it just Egyptians? Was it just Copts? Or pure Egyptians? Or was there any other ethnicities, like for example the Greeks, the Jews, somebody else? And how were they represented in Egypt? What influence did they have on the original Egyptian people? Was Egypt, after Christianity started, how was it run? How was the Egyptian people, or at the time back then, the Christians, how did they live? Were they affected by other cultures? Was there, did the emperor or the ruler or the king at the time was Christian or not? And how did that affect the Copts, the actual Christian Egyptians that lived at the time? All these questions actually intrigued me and haunted me. I wanted to know the answers to these questions. And furthermore, as time passed, after so many centuries have passed on our ancestors, how did they manage being invaded by other cultures? Like, for example, the Kurds invaded Egypt, the Arabs invaded Egypt, the Ottomans invaded Egypt, the French, the English, almost every major power in the world at the time invaded Egypt. And the problem with Egypt is the people are very hospitable. So instead of kicking them out of the country, they actually stayed in the country and influenced our culture, either positively or negatively. From our perspective as Copts, from what I've researched and found, Copts were basically a very solid entity. They were not permissive to absorb other cultures in their own, especially when it comes to our religion, especially when it comes to our faith. Furthermore, like after the introduction of other religions, for example, as Islam in Egypt, how did the Copts manage? How did they cope with another religion besides our own, besides our original Christianity? Even not other religions. What about the heresies that happened? Like the Arian heresy, about the Nestorian heresy, and other minor heresies that happens in Egypt. The rulers at one point belonged to another faith. They were Arian, for example, or the Roman emperor was Arian and the Christians in Egypt were Orthodox. How did they cope with this? Was it acceptable? Were the people accepting to adopt the faith of their emperor or their king? Or did they resist? After Islam, did the people rise? Was it like they call it, like the invaders call it, is it the invasion? Was it the invasion of the Egypt, or was it opening Egypt, or how did the Copts accept that? Why so many Copts? Because we call everybody in Egypt a Copt, whether they're Muslims, Christians, Jews, or whatever. They're all Copts. Copts means Egyptian, basically. How did the Egyptians live at the time? Did they accept it? Did they refuse it? Did they cause uprisings? Did they resist? Or they were basically sheep that just were led to whatever their shepherd wanted? These are questions that actually haunted me for the longest time, that I wanted to know the answer to. This was one of the reasons that I wrote the book, to actually educate myself first of all, and then whomever is interested in the subject. The way you read a history book, first of all, history is a very dry subject. It needs to be interesting. And people will find, basically, if they read about history, they're looking for a certain episode, they're looking for a certain part, not necessarily all the history of a certain country, or a certain region, or for certain people. If you're looking for a certain part of the history, in our history you will find it most probably. The history of the church. What about the history of our popes? Were all the popes alive? Were they all saints? Or were there people who were serving themselves more than the church? Why were the Copts so persecuted for their belief? Why were the Christian Copts so persecuted for their beliefs? Up until today. These were some of the questions that really haunted me for the longest time, that I really wanted the answers for. Furthermore, when we were growing up in Egypt and went to school, this entire part of our history was never mentioned in school. We went from the pharaohs to the Muslim opening of Egypt. Where were we at the time? Where did we exist? Or we had no background. This is like created a sort of a void for me. I needed to find the answers. I needed to find where we came from. What's our background? Yes, we have a very strong culture in Egypt that, like, when you read in the books, it is not there. Even when I grew up a bit and searched in other books about our history, Coptic historians, the Christian historians that wrote about our history in Egypt tend to whitewash everything for several reasons. Maybe because of persecution, maybe because of fear, maybe because of their own reasons. But there was no neutrality. They never called what is black black and what is white white. History tends to be written by whoever conquered, never by whomever was conquered. In this book, I'm trying to just find the answers, find the truth, and just presented the best or the correct way that it should be represented. It took years to put together, but like at least I answered most of my questions. If you want to know the answers, well, you can read the book. Thank you.